It is so wonderful to see everybody tonight. My name is Uri Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Slifka Center for Jewish Life at Yale. And together with Jason Rubinstein, Rabbi, and Howard M. Holtzman, Jewish chaplain, I want to welcome everyone who's joined us tonight for this evening's Slifka online Salon with Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin, who has been described as author of some of the most creative Jewish environmental thinking in recent years, entitled Fear, Action, Resilience, Jewish Responses to Climate Crisis. Given that we're in the midst of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, a festival in which we spend more time in and connecting with nature than any other holiday, makes this a perfect time for this important conversation. When our students told us that the person they most wanted to hear from on this topic is Rabbi Cardin, we knew that she was the real deal, and we're proud to share her with all of you tonight. More about tonight's program in a moment. After the strangeness of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur under COVID-19 restrictions, I was ready for Sukkot to bring some normalcy. Then I heard some conversation about whether eating in the Sukkah is more like being outside with a low COVID risk or like being inside with a higher risk. I heard some folks say that a Sukkah with 3 walls restricts airflow and is more like being inside, but that a Sukkah with 2.5 walls has enough airflow to be safe. Still others said that it depends on what your schach, the roof of your sukkah, is made of to see if air passes through it easily enough. This made me think that the many Talmudic discussions about seemingly minute details may not be so far off the mark after all. What is acceptable risk? How do we balance risk with living our lives? And how can this holiday protect us from this living virus? Yale students are in the thick of safety and balance questions too. At a time when students should be building relationships that will last them a lifetime and having communal experiences that will set them on lifelong journeys, they're stuck in their rooms behind Zoom screens, regardless of whether in New Haven, studying remotely, or taking time off from school. Wherever they are, students are grappling with isolation and anxiety about their futures, on top of the normal stresses appropriate to that life stage. As we all are, Yale students are continuing to confront the serious emotional, physical, financial, and social downstream effects of the pandemic at a time in which their whole life trajectories hang in the balance. In response, Slifka Center is offering a robust community for students to be a part of. We're offering a combination of online and in-person programs to include as many students as we can in our community, regardless of their enrollment status or geographic location. We're giving out Shabbat boxes and holiday care packages in person and mailing them around the country. We're facilitating cohorts of students exploring Jewish values, topics, and opportunities. We're offering grants for students to do intensive research projects that impact the world. We're providing pastoral care to those who want and those who need, including facilitating access to mental health counseling. We're active and present in New Haven, in cyberspace, and anywhere else a Yale student is residing and struggling through these difficult times. We've been getting good feedback so far, and there's a long way to go. We thank you for being partners in this important work with us. I want to remind everyone that Slifka Center does not receive any direct funding from Yale and relies on charitable contributions to continue our work. Contributions are fully tax deductible. I also remind everyone that for a limited time, contributions to Slifka Center's current capital campaign are eligible for Yale reunion, class, and capital campaign credit. This campaign will help fund Slifka Center's first major renovation in its 25 years, which includes the kosher kitchen, dining hall, and security infrastructure. Please be in touch with us if you're interested in learning more. So on to tonight's program. As usual, Rabbi Jason Rubinstein will introduce our speaker and also monitor and facilitate questions and comments in the chat, which can be found along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website along with recordings of our previous Slifka Center salons. We also hope you'll take a moment to fill out the brief survey at the end. The link will be in the chat box. We're excited to share these salons with all of you in keeping with Slifka Center's goals to explore the intersection of what is Jewish, American, and Yale in our constantly changing world. It's now my pleasure to turn over the program to my friend, teacher, and colleague, Rabbi Jason Rubinstein. You're on
Thank
mute.
you, Uri, for that lovely introduction and for framing tonight's learning, which is obviously not at Yale and at Slifka Center in any geographic sense, but is very much of Slifka Center and expresses what we try to do day in and day out in countless conversations and emails. And I want to say just a few words of gratitude and appreciation to tonight's featured speaker, Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin. And I'm going to try to do this in a bit more personal vein than I normally do. Rabbi Cardin's works, and especially her first book, Tears of Sorrow, Seeds of Hope, a Jewish spiritual companion for infertility and pregnancy loss, really mark a kind of watershed in Jewish writing and an indispensable guide for rabbis of my generation who came along into a Jewish landscape and really a definition of what it means to be a Jewish spiritual leader. Who's enriched, deepened, transformed by Rabbi Cardin and her work. It's actually, I was shocked when in preparing these remarks, I learned that Rabbi Cardin's book had been published just 7 years before I started rabbinical school, because it had in that short time become a classic and an exemplar of the depth of spiritual sensitivity, ethical acumen, and facility with the tradition that we all aspired to, whether we ever thought we would get there or not. And in the years since, Rabbi Cardin has continued to do important work on a variety of pastoral issues, centering on infertility and pregnancy loss, but extending far beyond that, including stormy adolescent years and other areas, and has been really one of the leaders in formulating ideas and also practices, communities, and organizations that take the environment as a topic of not just urgent ethical and moral and existential organizing, which it of course is, but also a central topic in Jewish spirituality, which has been overlooked in many ways for far too long. And so it's really in that vein, with the environment at the forefront of our students' minds, and you at the forefront of their kind of pantheon of speakers, the grandiose image, that we're excited to have you. For those of you who are not regularly in conversation with folks who are in your 20s, I can report that there is no issue that consistently cuts as deep and where the urgency runs as high as climate catastrophe. Students write their college essays about spending time with their grandparents in Florida in areas that will probably be underwater when they themselves have grandchildren. They regularly discuss topics of whether it's ethical or even imaginable to bring children into a world that will be increasingly disturbed and troubled by mass migrations, conflict, and drought. And these conversations, which sit at the nexus of not just the future, but very much the present of our students' lives, are ones that we're grateful to bring your voice into, Rabbi Cardin. And the question now, with all of that freighted on the next hour, the question I really want to open with is one of framing. And what I mean by that is there are so many different kind of fundamental axes along which one could begin and orient a conversation about the environment. You could take biodiversity as one. You could take 2 degrees Celsius. You could take carbon amounts in the environment since the last ice age. You could take moral questions of human solidarity. You could take biological requirements of the human species or of civilization. And I want to ask, from a Jewish lens, maybe not the Jewish lens, but at least a profound Jewish lens, where you would have us start the conversation. What's at stake? How can we wrap our heads around this, on some level, unthinkably large and complex question? Over the course of tonight, we're going to start from there. I can't promise to you all in the audience that by the end of the night, we will have given you a checklist of the 10 commandments of Jewish environmentalism. I think we're going to be operating at a slightly higher level of abstraction than that, really kind of thinking and feeling our way into an approach to the question, which can inspire us, but maybe not terrify us into inaction. And I want to repeat Uri's invitation to really populate the chat with your questions and comments. I will be mining your words, and especially as you respond to one another, for the questions we'll call on and draw out later on in the presentation. So Rabbi Cardin, if you would start off really from the beginning in the broadest frame about, from the richness of Jewish tradition, where you would draw the kind of orienting axes of an environmental approach nowadays in the year 2020.
Thank you for that introduction. It's a little bit daunting to be here with an introduction, especially like that. So, for all of you who do introductions, or who want to just tone it down a little bit so the expectations aren't so high that you don't just automatically disappoint people by by what you do, by your humanity. But I really do thank you so much for that. Also, let me just say I've been getting notices that my connection is unstable, which is making me extremely anxious, of course. So, Jason, if you don't mind emailing me the phone number in case I do have to call in instead of being here with you in video, that would be fabulous. So welcome to all of you. And again, welcome especially to those folks whom I know who have joined, whom I haven't seen in a while. And it's a joy to be here. I want to start with actually a dictionary definition that came up today in dictionary.com. I don't know how many of you know dictionary.com. And actually, if you want to start sharing the screen to let people see that, that would be great. It seemed to be extraordinarily timely. Let me just get back to my notes as well. And the the word was eco-anxiety, right? Eco-anxiety, anxiety caused by a dread of environmental perils, especially climate change, and the feeling of helplessness over the potential consequences for those living now, and even more so for those in later generations. This is a real thing. And as Rabbi Rubinstein said, this is really something that affects many of us, whether we are in our teens and 20s in college, whether we are in our middle age, and especially those of us who are grandparents. I have, as my grandparents would say, Kanai Nahara, 10 grandchildren, 2 of whom were born this summer during COVID. And I must say, I wonder with great pain, what is their world going to be like? And yet Judaism does not allow us to despair. And Judaism requires that we have hope. And the paradox is, if there is no next generation, there is no hope. So in a sense, the only hope for the next generation is in the next generation and working with them and for them. So we do have to move forward. But I also want to just acknowledge this personal element of what I would call eco guilt, because my generation was perhaps the most charmed generation. We lived the height of the blessings of fossil fuel and the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel technology. And we lived it in some sense ignorant and oblivious of the dangers that it was causing. So we lived it gleefully and gratefully. I remember playing with toy gas stations, little cars, little gas pumps, with little roofs, and we would just love playing with little gas stations, not realizing that in fact, 50 years later or so, 60 years later, we would be realizing that those little toys that we were playing with were in fact sources of the destruction of the world. So my generation that lived the glory days of that truly has to step up to the plate and work to make sure that the next generation doesn't suffer the outcome of our blessings. And I say that for any of you who have parents and grandparents who are not yet totally engaged in this, help them figure out how to be totally engaged. For those of us on the call who are totally engaged, God bless you, because that is our calling at this stage of the game. Thomas Berry said that there's a great work in each generation, and it's a great work that is thrust upon us, that we didn't ask for and we might not even like, and that might be even painful. The great work of our collective generation is making sure that this earth can survive in a Holocene era, even when we're in an Anthropocene era. But my generation's great work is absolutely to dedicate the last decades of our lives to making sure that we create a world that is livable, because we enjoyed the fruits of the very cause of degradation. So I wanted to just sort of ground us, as if you all needed grounding, in some of the challenges that are facing us. So one, what are some of the problems of climate change and the great degradations that we're living today? Well, there is great global disruption. We know that right now, 1% of the land of the world, of the land of the world are unlivable. There are hot zones so terrible people can't live there. But scientists assess that in 50 years, those unlivable areas of the globe, of the land of the globe, may cover 20%, of the land. We know in Israel now, this past summer it was so hot that people couldn't even go outside. We cannot obviously, continue to have a world of 7, 8, 9, 10 billion people with a fifth less of the land mass that we can live on. Today, 2.3 billion people live with water insecurity, and another 10 years, another 500 million will do that. And it's interesting that we should talk about water now, because especially this is the holiday when we pray for rain. This is the holiday when we know that water is the essence of life, and that if we pray for rain every year, because Judaism has experienced, the rabbinic tradition has experienced the fragility of life based on the fact that water is not always something we can, that is guaranteed to us. And then in addition, of course, there's species extinction and loss of habitat and just generally, and this, I don't know why people are not totally overwhelmed by this compelling thought. We don't know if there is life, much less conscious life, anywhere else in the universe. We live in a jewel of a planet, and it is just a magical place. And how dare we even begin to think, for selfish reasons, for greed, for hunger, for business benefits, for corporate benefits, for makeup, whatever it might be, that we can dare destroy it, because we might be destroying the only life that there is in the entire universe. And again, as Thomas Berry, whom I just enjoy quoting, Thomas Berry says, we human beings are the consciousness of the world. We might be the only ones who recognize that the universe is here. And we have this great power in this recognition to appreciate what we have. And in that great appreciation, how dare we destroy it? So that's global destruction. But we also know beyond that, there's an inequity in this climate change, right? We know that climate change will not affect everybody, does not affect everybody equally. We know that Black people in America are exposed to 1.5 times more particulate matter than non-Hispanic whites, though non-Hispanic whites are more responsible for the creation of that particulate matter, right? Hispanics are 1.2 times they get 1.2 times the exposure of the non-Hispanic whites. Asthma rates in Black children are double those of white children. You know these data, and they grate at us, especially those of us who can, in this era of COVID, stay at home, get our food delivered to us, work from home, gather like this. We know that there's inequity out there, and it's not so much the guilt, it's the pain that we feel in that inequity. And that should move us to work as much as we can in ways that will rectify these inequities. And then finally, in case none of those move people, there's a financial harm. It is just costing this world way too much to not respond to climate change and not to fix it. So you can see here, climate-related disasters cost $2.245 trillion of damage in the last 20 years. And now these previous 20 years, 151% increase over the previous 20 years in costs. It makes economic sense to respond to climate change. So we have to do all that. And it's just about 15 years ago when I decided I was going to get involved in the environmental movement, because I just was somewhat embarrassed by the way the Jewish community was not involved. And I thought, as I began to talk about this, I thought, well, there's something wrong with me in not being able to convince more people, more Jews, to get involved. Maybe my messaging isn't right. So I went to school actually to learn about messaging climate change. And I realized it wasn't me. It is difficult to get people to be motivated. But I think that this summer has been different. I think this summer was part of a great awakening of people understanding climate change, because of the hurricanes, because of the fires, because of the floods, because of the heat, because of COVID, because of the disproportionate way that people of color have been affected by COVID, because of environmental injustices. And I think we're on the cusp of a new era of actually responding to climate change and having people respond to climate change. So I think that there is hope. And so all of us who've been in this war, in this field, and have been disappointed and frustrated and need to pick ourselves up, now's the time to pick ourselves up and get back in the game full time. Because I think that people are now ready to hear again what we need to say. And what do we need to say? Seems to me, you can sort of advance the note, seems to me that there should be a frame. There should be something like a universal Hippocratic oath that says, to the earth that sustains you, do no harm. And in a sense, Jason, that's sort of a, sort of that overarching frame when you talked about, how do we approach this? There's so many discrete ways that we are affected by climate change. So many discrete areas, and how do you attack them? And as a matter of fact, again, like 15 years ago, when I started getting involved in Jewish environmentalism, and I heard about sort of discrete ways that people were talking about the issue, I said, what is that underlying ethic that unites all of this and combines this and moves us forward in this united way? And I hate to tell you, it took me till this past year to figure it out. But I will tell you, well, what I want to suggest is that unifying frame that keeps us all going, which is essentially the Jewish approach, which says, to the earth that sustains you, do no harm. This is a promise that we in fact find in Torah, right? In Genesis, after the story where the world almost was destroyed. It wasn't climate change with the CO2, but it was climate change with water. Right? In Genesis 8, the text says, the Lord speaking to the divine self said, by the way, I just love that, because I don't know how we know exactly what God says to God's self, but this is clearly a promise that God is making to God's self. And not only does God not break God's promises, but God will not break a promise that God makes to God's self. So this is the ultimate promise of all. Never again will I doom the earth because of humanity, nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done. And then it goes on in this most poetic way. So long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. What does that mean? The cycles of the earth, the sustainability of the earth, in our terms, science, in the Holocene era of the earth, shall never cease by my hand. Because I promise all of you, all of creation, humanity and all of creation, that you shall forever endure. And so the question is, if God promised, God's self, that there will never be disruption like there was before, we ourselves have to make sure that we are not the instrument that brings about that destruction. And Judaism promises that for us, and it calls us to do that. I remember probably 25 years ago, a long time ago, I heard a lecture at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and it was an academic. He was an academic from Columbia University. He stood in Unterberg Auditorium of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he said, "This world is an amoral world. The world does not care. Doesn't care about you, doesn't care about anything. It's an accidental world. It is an amoral world. And that has certain impacts about how we should live." And I don't know how everybody else thought about that in the room, but to this day, I remember that. And I said, oh, that is just wrong. You cannot have creatures like we have on the earth. You cannot have conscious life, sentient life like we have, and believe that the world is truly amoral. And I go even further, even if someone can make that case, even if logic can make that case, I would say that Judaism and we cannot make that case. We fight against the case that it is an amoral world. This world means something. Torah says the world has a purpose. Humans have a purpose. We are not meant for chaos, and we'll see that in a couple of texts. We are not meant for chaos. We are humanity. the consciousness of the universe. We are the ones that celebrate the magnificence of the world. And the world is magnificent. And it is made more magnificent because there are those of us who can appreciate it and see it. Can you imagine if there's this whole grand universe and we weren't here and nobody was here? Remember that wonderful line in the movie Contact, like if there's no life out there, it's an awful waste of space. There's this whole universe and there's no other life out there. It's an awful waste of space. Well, I would say take it back one step. If there were this whole universe and nobody knew it, that would be just an awful waste of creation. And what Torah is telling us, it's not a waste of creation because we are here. We are its consciousness. We are its witness. We are its celebrants. And the last thing we can be is its destroyers, right? So Isaiah, we can see this call to becoming those celebrants and preservers of the world in Isaiah. And I want to posit that in this verse of Isaiah is that unifying theory, Jason, that you were asking me about. So Isaiah says, Adonai, the creator of the heavens, is God, the one who fashions the earth and makes her. God establishes her. Not for chaos did God create her, but for dwelling was she made. So it says, Lashevet Yitzara, Lo Tohu V'Ra'ah, not for chaos was she made, but for dwelling. And this phrase, Lashevet Yitzara, becomes in the rabbinic jargon, Yeshuv Ha'olam, the establishment of the world. The world was not meant for chaos. What is chaos? Chaos is instability, lack of order, disruption, the inability to sustain life. And what Isaiah is saying is that is not what the world is all about. The world is not amoral. It is not chaotic. It is not meant to be chaotic. It is orderly. It is here to sustain and celebrate life. And dwelling, Lashevet Yitzara, for she was made for dwelling. Dwelling means it's a world of fertility, of self-renewal, like Genesis 1 said, right? Again and again, there's this refrain in Genesis 1 that the world wasn't just created, but it was created as a self-regenerative world. That's the world that we are given. That's the world that is precious. That's the world that we are bidden to preserve. And humanity is here as an element of that self-renewal. Humanity is here to use the world, Lashevet Yitzara, to dwell in it, to make it habitable, but to do it so that it enhances further habitability. That's really what we're all about. And it's not just my interpretation. I mean, Rashi seems to absolutely hone in on this in his terse way of saying it, right? So Rashi on this verse says, the Holy One did not create her to be chaos, means God did not create the world to be chaos, but for habitation and for dwelling. What does that mean? For all to engage in the settling of the world. Lihiyot asukim b'yeshuvo shel olam, that we have to be asukim b'yeshuvo shel olam. What does asukim means? Asukim is the same word that we say in the morning blessings, right? La'asok b'divrei Torah, right? We have to be engaged in it. We have to be immersed in it. It has to consume us. This is our calling. We are called as Jews to study Torah so we know how to live in this world. We are called as Jews to be engaged in the building up of the world. So again, humanity is not a blight on the world, right? It's not like we shouldn't be here because we mess things up. We are meant to be those who build up the world, create the world, bring it to a fuller way of existence than even God brought it to. And we have to be la'asok b'yeshuvo shel olam. We've got to be engaged in the settling of the world. And so the long and the short of it is, Jason, that's the answer. And then I'll keep going in a moment to sort of begin to unpack that and to get to hopefully ways that we can, and the Jewish tradition has taught us how we should respond. But let me just pause here. I haven't been able to follow the chat. I don't know if there are elements and questions.
Just had a little Whitman introduced to the chat. I wanted to, it's extremely moving, right? If I just want to try to kind of restate it for my own sake and that of everyone, the dozens of folks who are joined us, that there's a, there's what I understand to be putting forward. It's a variant of it. I think a more profound and humble and inspiring variant of this idea of, that humanity is the measure of all things or the pinnacle of creation. You're not saying something that egotistical, but no. There's a kind of a poignant uniqueness in human consciousness and our recognition of beauty and of finitude and of grandeur. And our fact of consciousness of ourselves and of the universe. And that puts a responsibility on us as well, that creates the possibility of responsibility and creates a certain kind of very profound harmony of a unique role that we play in creation, rather than being a blight, but having our own distinctive, in certain ways privileged, and at times maybe not easy, but completely vital role to play, at least in Earth and at least in the part of the universe that we know about. And I do encourage people, as Rabbi Cardin just did, to share your questions, observations, reactions in the chat. I want to take the privilege of doing one and ask you to kind of respond to what's hard, and I'll describe this hardness, and I want to do it actually in a textual vein by noting an ellipsis in your one of the previous texts here. So if we'll go back to the screen share here. That this segment here, when God says, "I won't strike down the world anymore," ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra min orav, is elided in your translation, and the translation goes, it's kind of a vexed passage. It's hard to translate, not because it's hard to translate, because it's hard to know exactly what it means, but it's something along the lines of the inclinations of the human heart are ra, which I'm going to translate as destructive, and you can challenge me on that translation for a reason I'll say in a second, from our very inception, right? This isn't one of those pictures like Rousseau that human beings start out good, but culture leads us astray. There's something of the bent timber of humanity. We're not made all that well. And the reason I'm taking Ra here, that there's something about us that's destructive as the translation, is because it seems to be just in the spirit that you were describing, the kind of motif of God observing Genesis again and again in that first chapter in creation, when God describes those things as tov, as good, the sense there is not an immoral sense, like the water is good, the stars are good, but in a sense of, we might talk about a good car or a good watch or a good, view, right? That it's something that just kind of works and reproduces itself and is ongoing. And that the bad there as a opposite, as a contradiction, is not a moral badness, but it's the opposite of creation and endurance and flourishing. That there's something destructive, short-sighted, self-defeating, built into who and what it means to be a person. And I think we see that kind of writ large right now, that humanity left to our own devices may end up being destructive. And we also, I think probably all of us feel it in certain moments of, well, I have to look out for myself and my family and my group and my projects, kind of come what may. But I'm willing to do that, or I need to do that. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit as we get into the kind of rabbinic response of how we kind of are called on to make that call practical. How we deal with those kind of darker parts of ourselves that make this a challenge and not something that's obvious that we solved 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago as a country and as a species.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yes, I did elide over that. You're absolutely right, because it is hard and it pulls us in another direction. Let's go there. Let's go there for a minute. First of all, I think one of the things that it's saying is, in a very humbling way, that creation is magnificent despite humanity, right? I mean, it actually takes humanity, I think, off its pedestal, right? And says, regardless of what humanity does, creation is magnificent. Creation has a purpose, right? creation is not amoral. I think that's in a sense what it's saying here, that that creation is God's extraordinary gift and God's extraordinary joy. God's just so very proud of this. And so God will, and I think God is saying, how impetuous was I? How wrong was I to think that because of one element of my creation was bad? And I do think, Jason, that this might be a moral bad. I do think that, because one sort of misbehaved. One did not live up to the visioning that I had of it, that I should create, that I should destroy all of creation. Oh no. I can't do that. So that's one. And two, I think in reading back into it, we can say, yes, this is a cautionary tale. We all have those darker elements of our lives and our desires. It is very hard for us to keep a check on our appetite, right? And it's very hard for us to not want what the other wants. And it's very hard, not even if we think that we're good about it, but the continuing development of technology and things and creation requires, in some sense, that we continue to acquire more and we create more, and our curiosity, right, and our desire for discovery is going to have us do more and more, and it will have greater impact on the earth. So I think it's saying, look, despite how humanity behaves, God will, and we should not destroy the earth. And we have to be cautionary about this, because we have to continually fight against that easy slide into using the earth as our plaything, using the earth in whatever greedy way we might want right now, because that will lead us to darker times and destruction. So I think that it does actually serve to caution us that we have to overcome that. God had to overcome that, and we have to overcome that. So that's one way I would answer. But I'd love to hear if others have anything to say about that.
As others collect their thoughts, would you be willing to share the section in the response? Maybe if you could point us to one of the sources that you feel like really, if you're to kind of, people were to take one, not a marching order, but okay, I'm going to wake up in the morning and someone's going to ask me, what did you learn? Judaism says I can do this week, this year for our planet and for our fellow human beings and future generations. What's the source you would like to be able to point them to from the rest of what you've collected here? And I just want to note, Rabbi Cardin, if the recent author of the conservative movement's kind of official responsum on this matter. So if you want to read your thoughts at much greater length, and I encourage you to, so it's a terrific piece of really 21st century Jewish thought. I encourage you to do so. And I'm asking you right now to kind of select and distill one for us.
You should see my cutting room floor, from preparing for today. I just kept cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting. All right, let me go with two. Let's go to that Seder Hayom, right, sort of limit, I sort of title as the response. So Seder Hayom, commentary Mishnah Avot 521 is about what do we do at various stages of our lives? How do we mark the various stages of our lives? And one of the stages of our lives is procreation. And what is procreation all about? And so Seder Hayom comments, the basis of the mitzvah to procreate is in order to leave a blessing after yourself, which is the perpetuation of the species, generation after generation, and the world remains, quote unquote, Kohelet. And thus, the human becomes a partner of the Holy One in the works of creation. So the idea here is, the rabbis talk a lot about Pruruvu, and there are a lot of texts that I had about Pruruvu, you shall procreate, and I cut them all, but essentially what these explanations of Pruruvu, procreate, is about is not about having more children per se. It's not about the number of children that you have. It's about creating a world that sustains itself in a glorious way. And that's what Seder Hayom is saying, in order to leave a blessing after yourself. And the blessing is not the number of children. The blessing is a world in which your children can inhabit, in fulfillment of their opportunities and desires and curiosity and discovery and love and joy. So if we thought and this might seem facile, but it's not. If we thought truly with almost every act that we can consciously pay attention to, ask ourselves, is this going to be a blessing for those who come after me? Is this going to be a blessing for those who are around me? Is this going to be a blessing even for those people around the world? When I turn on my light switch, what is the impact of that? Am I burning fossil fuels? Do I have green energy? Right? Who's getting put to work or who's getting polluted by what I do? If our job in having children is to leave a blessing after us, it means that we have to create the environment in which those children can be blessed. And so the idea is not, again, to have children. The idea is to create a world in which living is sustainable and glorious and can give us the full opportunity of life that existence promises. And just to say it again, we cannot continually live our lives self-conscious about every act that we take. But I do want to encourage us to think as much as possible that we should live on two levels, living our lives and then evaluating everything that we do in our lives and how it affects the world around us, the environment, and the future generations. The more we think about that, the more conscious we'll be about that. So the reason I pause is because there are two texts that I want to say right after. Okay, so let me skip Sefer HaChinuch for the moment, and let me skip Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, because I want to come back to both of them, but especially I want to come back to Hirsch. But let's go down to see interconnectivity of it all. And this is really sort of a way to understand why we really have to think about everything that we do. And it's hard to do, but I would bet it's not as hard as we think. When we have children, when we have ailing parents, when there's something in our life that overwhelms our consciousness, we think about what we do and how it impacts our children, how it impacts our ailing parent, and how it impacts us. We do that right now with COVID. Can I do this? Because if I do this, it might affect who I can see tomorrow and who I can see for the next 2 weeks. And we sort of have this consciousness of being very aware of our actions now, because our actions have real life implications with what we can do tomorrow. I will give you a personal example, and then we'll get to Gor Aryeh in a minute. My son and his family live on the street behind us, and we have been a pod for 3 or 4 months now, so that I could see my children and my grandchildren, and we could be with them, we could help them, they could come and visit. And certainly for Sukkot, we were all planning to have Sukkot together. So for 3 or 4 months, my children and my grandchildren have not been playing with other children. They have not been going to school. They have been isolated so that we can be together. Erev Sukkot, for some reason, impetuousness overtook them, and 2 of my grandchildren played with their neighbors whose parents go to work and broke the pod. I don't know how many of us have these scenarios, and I cannot see my family now for all of Sukkot, right? We know that these things that we live now affect daily who we interact with, whether we can go see our parents and our grandparents, whether we can go to work, who might be sick. So I'm arguing that we should try to live that consciously about climate change in our behaviors. And so there's a way that this is played out with Gor Aryeh. So let's go to the text. The Deuteronomy says, as many of you know, when you happen upon a bird's nest, do not take the mother together with the chicks. Send away the mother and take only the young, in order that you enjoy well-being in the length of days. That in and of itself is a whole shiur, is a whole lesson of sustainability. How much consumption is okay? How much consumption destroys sustainability, right? How do you decide how appetites and consumption should play off one another? Okay, we're not going to go there, but you all know that, right? You can't kill mother and child in one fell swoop, right? You have to make sure that there's a sustainable source of life, and you can, if you're not a vegetarian like me, you can take the young and eat it. Okay, but it goes on. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Do not plant kilayim, different kinds of plants that are forbidden to be planted together in your vineyard. Do not plow with an ox and an ass together. Those couplings are not permitted. And do not wear shatnez, right? Do not wear linen and wool. That is a coupling that is not acceptable. Okay, these are just sort of, it just looks like a series, a listing, an anthology of things you're supposed to do and you're not supposed to do. But Gur Aryeh, the Maharal of Prague, says, you know what? This listing of things is actually very, very interesting. This is why these verses were placed adjacent to one another. You know, the rabbis love to understand why things are next to one another. So why are these things juxtaposed to one another? Why these verses are, if they're so individual, they could be placed anywhere in any order. But he's saying they're not. They're placed here in a particular order. So maybe they're not so distinct one from another. Maybe there's some sort of internal connection among them. Maybe there's a lesson we can learn. So he says, it appears there's a good reason for the fact that one mitzvah leads to another. In other words, these mitzvot aren't just a laundry list. These mitzvot lead one into another. The one who sends away the mother is maintaining Yishuv Ha'olam, right? That phrase that I mentioned from Isaiah. This is the fundamental responsibility and obligation to settle the world. One who sends away the mother is maintaining Yishuv Ha'olam by leaving the nest such that it is not altogether destroyed. Therefore, he, the person who sends away the mother bird and just takes the baby, that person also merits a form of Yishuv Ha'olam in that he is a house. Right? He left the nest. And that awareness of leaving that nest means that he is now creating an articulation of Yishuv Ha'olam because he understands the preciousness of his house. And if he fulfills the mitzvah of a parapet, right, putting a fence around, railing around the roof of the house so no one should get hurt, he will also merit a field, which is also a form of Yishuv Ha'olam. Like somehow, closing off your roof establishes a safe area. And that leads to your understanding that there is a field which allows you to grow food that you can sustain you, which is also a form of Yishuv Ha'olam. And if he fulfills the mitzvah connected with the field, he will merit an ox and an ass, which are themselves necessary for Yishuv Ha'olam. I mean, you can see it goes on and on and on, right? If he doesn't wear shatnez, he'll merit a cloak with tzitzit. Scripture, and this is the punchline, Scripture always calls forth something which is more fundamental to the establishment needs of the world, that is the Yishuv V'tzorach Ha'olam, before that which follows. For it's well known that sending away the mother bird is a matter of the absolute continuity of the species, whereupon he merits a house, which is necessary to the settlement of the species, and then a field, then an ox, and an ass, then clothing, and this is clear. So what do we learn from this? That the more we are aware of the smallest behavior that we act out as an expression of Yishuv Ha'olam, as an expression of caring for the environment, as an expression of not degrading climate, the more we will act intentionally in ways that do not degrade the climate. So I think, Jason, that this might be an answer to your question. But fundamental text is an extraordinary and elevated consciousness about what we're doing. The shoes that we buy, literally the energy that we purchase for our houses, the materials that we use, to build, the paper that we use, the pens that we use, just the hair products that we use. I mean, there is nothing that we do that doesn't affect the environment, that doesn't come from the environment, affect the environment as we use it, and affect the environment as we throw it away. And if we knew that this cyclical structure of use, of extraction, consumption, use, and as it were, throwing things away, if we knew that every aspect of that affects the world, then we would be more conscious about it, and we would make sure that our law. I mean, how many of us in Maryland, for example, we're fighting against styrofoam, we're fighting against plastic bags, and on the one hand you say, really, We're spending all of this time and money on plastic bags or on styrofoam. But yes, because we know that plastic straws. I had a Thanksgiving dinner last year and we wanted to make a time capsule. And we asked everybody to create, just come up with an idea of what we would put in the time capsule. And one extremely wise woman said, I'm going to put a plastic straw in the time capsule because God willing, in 20 years, 30 years, when your time capsule's open, people will not have any idea, what a plastic straw looked like because they'll be, they'll be outlawed. If we care about plastic straws, which seems like an awful waste of time just to care about plastic straws, but if we care about plastic straws, we will then build our intentionality and our conscientiousness about other behaviors. So I would say, knowing that everything we do is to bring a blessing to the world, and knowing that everything we do affects everything else that we do and establishes a consciousness in us so that it becomes second nature, that what we do will contribute to the blessed sustainability of the world. And just one more thing, it will not mean that we do it alone. We all know we can't do this alone. We can only do this in concert. We can only do this if we advocate. We can only do this if we have the laws. We can only do this if corporations and businesses go along with us. So this is not about us alone. This is about us creating our consciousness so that we do it ourselves, but we also do it in concert with everyone. So again, let me pause here before I maybe go back to Samson Raphael Hirsch.
It's very, very inspiring. And we have a question here actually from Sophie Lieberman, who's a senior in Yale College, really at the kind of forefront of climate thinking and activism at Yale. So Sophie, would you be willing to share this question with Rabbi Cardin and all of us here?
Yeah, so I was kind of wondering, thinking back to the text that you presented at the beginning, what jumped out at me was kind of the centrality of the human presence on Earth as being what motivates us to think about the future and to think about how we're caring for the earth. And something I always am conflicted about is whether my eco-anxiety, as you called it, is stemming from just kind of an existential understanding of the world, that the world should exist, or that it's my own presence on Earth. And I know that it veers kind of into more complicated territory of just the fundamental value of human life, and that should never be compromised when we're talking about climate change or environmentalism. But I'm kind of was wondering if there's anything you would point to better understand how we might value human presence versus just the natural environment as a complete system.
It is a great question, and it's something of a problematic question. I would argue that humans are part of the whole. Humans are part of the whole, so it's not really one or the other. I will tell you hopefully quickly. One of the things I'm spending my time doing here, Sophie, especially as you know, in Maryland, is trying to create a constitutional amendment in the state of Maryland that assures that everyone has a right to a healthful environment. We need to put it in our constitution, making it a fundamental right along with the other fundamental rights that we have, because otherwise we will always be behind the 8 ball and fighting for environmental protection against other interests, especially property interests, economic interests, and the like. When I began this journey, I had to ask myself a question: what am I fighting for? Am I fighting for nature's rights? Right, the rights of nature to just be, right? The rights of rivers and forests and mountains and air to be. Am I fighting for nature's rights? Because there is a nature's rights movement out there. Or am I fighting for the human rights to a healthful environment? And I sort of felt that that's such a terrible, why do we even have to ask that question in that way? Because they are we are nature, right? We have those rights. Nature has a right to live. We have a right to live in a healthful environment. I had to go actually though with human rights. We call it the Environmental Human Rights Amendment, because nature's rights does not move enough people, right? Saying that that nature has a right to be independent of us doesn't move enough people. And I understand why. I'll be just very frank. I think in part with you, Sophie, I think nature has rights, as it were, independent of us, and that were we not here, and nature survived, that would still be something glorious. But I also think it would be incomplete, as we said before, because there would be no one to appreciate it, right? There would be no one here to celebrate it. There would be no one here to use it. And I think there's nothing wrong with using nature, right? Nature uses nature. If you don't use nature, everybody, it's static, it's dead. So I think that we have to try to overcome that duality and say, is us, or is it nature? We're part of nature, and we have a right to celebrate us as a part of nature, but celebrate us as a part of nature, not celebrate us as distinct from users, and the like. Nature is not a commodity. Nature is our community. And I think as long as we remember that, then we can, I think, get past that, the difficulty of that question, of that duality of that question. Does that help at all? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
We're just about to get to 9 o'clock. One thing, my chat has been such a delightful window into people just been kind of expressing so much appreciation. I wanted to kind of reflect some of that and take this moment here to pause for station identification. By thanking not just Rabbi Cardin and Uri, Slifka's wonderful executive director, but the whole team that makes an evening like tonight possible. Jennifer Rogen-Wallace, our development director, and Lynn Jackson-Quinn and Evan Wexler on the development team, and Emmanuel Cantor, our rabbinic intern. And also each and every one of you who really created a community of conversation, of care over the course of the evening, which I think is one of the things that, especially in this season when we can't gather by the dozens and the hundreds in synagogues, these virtual spaces become that much more vital, really, to sustaining our ability to connect with one another and remember that we're not alone. I want to also invite you all to the next of this series, which we're planning for. We're toggling between November 4 and 5 for the dates, but the speaker we have kind of approval for, unless the New York Times recruits her for a desperate last-minute pitch, is Emily Bazelon for a post. I was a professor at Yale Law School for a post-election conversation tentatively titled "What Just Happened." So keep on the lookout for that. I want to pause one question someone I was chatting, which I think is really kind of the perfect note to end on here, which is, all right, Carter, you mentioned, kind of the individual, and there's a virtue and a practice. I'm about to chat actually an Atlantic article that kind of touched on less on the spiritual side, but more on just the kind of ethical and character forming virtues of mindfulness around the environment. And then there's the political, right? The Constitution of the great state of Maryland, where I spent my adolescent years. And then there's something of an in-between scale, which is the institutions of the Jewish community, the Slifka centers and the synagogues. And I know you consulted and thought about this a lot. The question that came is, well, we're institutions that produce waste and consume energy and make decisions about, budgets, and maybe we feel like we can't afford the more environmentally friendly pens because we're running a deficit right now. But those kinds of questions come up. And so I'm just thinking in terms of this setting in which we gather, in which we feel kind of not alone, hopefully, and not just in the convenience of, well, we're all in one place, but in a deeper and more profound sense of something really sacred unites us. How, if you have a picture you could hold up of how a Jewish institution and Jewish community can lead in the ways you've been describing, contribute in the ways, do no harm in the ways you've been describing, I think that would be a very powerful way to kind of bring us together and kind of send us off into the different communities that we participate in.
Absolutely. First of all, I hope that people get to read some of the texts that we didn't get to, especially the Hirsch text. It's amazing that it was written 200 years ago or so, 150 years ago. Because he says what we need to say. So let me just say two things, and then I'll answer your question. Sefer HaChinuch, which is a book about the mitzvot, 613 mitzvot, talking about what they are, explaining it, says the very first mitzvah is sustainability. The very first mitzvah is sustainability. Samson Raphael Hirsch says the very first mitzvah is do no harm. So I mean, it's fundamental to these two interesting texts. Are going to say, the first thing about Judaism, take care of the world. Take care of the world. And that is our calling as a human being, which elevates us, taking care of the world. So just take a look at those texts. Okay, well, I hope I don't disappoint you in this next answer either, Jason, but I will tell you what we did because people have been asking us, especially with the tshuva of the conservative movement on sustainability. The question was really, with our tshuva and our tshuva saying that, in fact, Yishuvo Shalom is a fundamental command of individuals and the Jewish people. So how do we do that? And then people wanted us to translate that into action. Do cloth diapers or disposable diapers? Do I wash my dishes by hand or do I do it with the dishwasher? Do I sell my car or do I do Ubers? So all of these things. And we said, you know what? This one tshuva cannot answer that question. The magnitude of the issues is so grand, and it really depends. What if you are a synagogue, for example, that rents space from a senior center? That is a different question than if you are a synagogue that has a 10,000 square foot, 20,000, 50,000 square foot building that has a 20% occupancy. Depending on who you are, what your physical plant is, what your capacity is, what your budget is, who your people are, what age your constituency is. Whether you're in an urban environment or a rural environment, the specifics cannot be addressed in a centralized fashion like a tshuva. So what we said was we answered it structurally. First of all, make this issue a primary issue. It's got to be part of your consciousness. You've got to talk about it. It has got to be part of the values. Make this issue part of your structural, your administrative structure. There has to be someone, whether it's lay or professional, who owns the portfolio of sustainability, who sits on your governing board, right? Who is part of your leadership, so that they will constantly hold before the board and all the decision makers there issues of sustainability, right? Just as you go through a budget every month, you have to go through a sustainability assessment. How are we doing? What are our goals? Set goals. So many people who want to be sustainable and organizations don't set goals. In 6 months, what is going to be our goal in sustainability? Is it going to be about energy? Is it going to be about waste? Is it going to be about transportation, right? Is it going to be about helping our members? What are your goals going to be? Set the goals that are appropriate for you and your constituency and your situation. Do it personally, set personal goals, set institutional goals, set communal goals. Become active in advocacy, right? So make this a priority, make it a personal priority by setting goals, make it an institutional priority by having an individual who holds everybody's feet to the fire and holds that banner of sustainability and make sure that every decision made is made through the lens of sustainability. And joining your community for advocacy to make sure that the structures are there to live out a life, because you can't, you as we all are learning now, you can't recycle it. There's nobody going to pick up your recycling. Make sure that from conception of product to the end life of it, so it can begin life anew, it is sustainable. So it's only going to happen when we force businesses to do that and force government to do that. So become involved in advocacy. And as we're seeing, because we're sitting here in Sukkot outside, in the Sukkah and in, at least around here, extraordinary weather, remember to revel in this extraordinary world, because I think this is actually the other Barry who said this. We protect what we value, but we cherish and preserve what we love, something like that, right? If we love this earth so powerfully, we will protect it. So go out, revel in the earth, and then it will come naturally that you protect it. So, Wendell Berry, thank you so much.
Wow. Well, thank you. I mean, this is just, I feel like we've settled in a kind of profound place. And I just want to kind of raise up two things that you did for me. And I think for all of us this evening. The first is highlighted three things. The first is highlighted just the spiritual nature of the questions of sustainability, of the Earth's future, of the human place in it, of morality, responsibility, of our place in the vastness of the universe, our sense that there is right and wrong and good and evil, and that we can choose and don't always choose rightly. The kind of framing of those questions is those are the questions of religion and of Torah and of Judaism. That there's no kind of need to kind of add on or graft on a religion because it's right there.
Right there.
The second thing is then kind of grounding that in some of the most foundational Jewish texts, right? In the very beginning of the book of Genesis, in God's reflections on who God is, what is humanity, and what this earth is. And ultimately in a reframing of the first commandment of fertility as not just about the production of human bodies, but about the continuation of the viability of the human project into the future. And that is something that goes far and wide because a human body requires, the human mind and spirit require many resources, including the resource of hope, but more foundationally the resource of the earth. Yes.
But not just the human body, right? It's the whole. It's the earth. It's when God in Genesis 1 says it's Tov Mode, it's the whole that is Tov Mode, and more the individuals, but leading up to something that they're greater than the sum of the parts. So yeah, so it's not just not just the human body, it's all of us. Go ahead.
That correction is why you're leading the session and not me. one of many reasons. And just the last thing which you said at the very end, which I just want to raise up because we didn't devote as much time to it, but I think is so profound, is the cultivation of delight and of wonder and of celebration, which is so central to the Jewish cycle of time. If I can just offer one thought, we often think of the cycle between the 6 days of the week and Shabbat as one of work versus rest. Really, the better kind of rendering of the tradition is the 6 days of the week are about production, and Shabbat is about consumption. It's about actually how we delight in the world with others, and we experience its wonder, right? Whether it's, right now sitting out inside a sukkah, whether it's making sure to kind of notice the incredible delight of the food we eat and the bounty that we enjoy, and in clothes, wearing clothes that we love, right? And I just think that sense of, it's not an either or, and you share this very movingly in our conversation leading up to the session, right? Of, kind of sacrifice and reducing quality of life to, reduce our carbon footprint is a part of it, but it's not the whole story. There's actually a cultivation of a love of the world, which isn't always easy. There are forces that push against it, because kind of, wear us down and turn us into workaholics. And what you just raised up at the end, I just want to make sure to kind of hold a megaphone to your words, in the sense that actually one of the things that Judaism holds out is very much an insistence that human beings need opportunities to revel in what it means to be a creature and revel in creation, and to do that with one another, as you said, and your sense that actually that allows us to kind of square the circle. If we do it right and we really open our hearts, that will then allow us to go out into the hard work of thinking hard, holding our feet to the fire around ambitious goals and all those things. And that was just a very profound insight that you gave us. And I just wanted to thank you so much for that, and for making this conversation and the challenge you put out to Jewish institutions, including to us. We were listening, Uri and I were listening, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss on this front. Really one that we take very seriously, and just express a lot of gratitude for your voice, and a hope that in post-COVID times you'll be able to be physically present with our students and our staff to continue these conversations. But just closing with the word of real gratitude and appreciation of the cross distance. We've been able to benefit from your teaching and wisdom, and look forward to continuing this study and this work together. Thank you, Rabbi Cardin.
Thank you. Do we have 30 seconds more? Can we close with a prayer?
Yes, please do.
So if you scroll to the end, my husband and I were trying to my husband wrote the tshuva with me. And we were trying to figure out how do we close and how do we, again, on every day, bring our attention to what we need to do as people dedicated to, in fact, saving the world. So we wrote this prayer, and you'll see in the footnote, you want to scroll down there for a second, this is actually based on a kavanah that the rabbis put in the mouth of Hannah when she was praying for a child. So it's a kavanah that is an intentional prayer meant for life, right? For sustainability, for hope. It says, Ribono Shel Olam, right? God, everything you have made for a purpose. Air for breathing, water for drinking and bathing, land for living and growing, plants and animals in gracious abundance, and humanity to work and care for your earth. Inspire us every day to care for your earth so that we may fulfill your vision. Not as a wasteland did God create the earth, but as a home where we may live. Right? Lo tohu v'ra'ah l'sheva yitzara. So, Ken Yehi Ratzon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.